Computer, done. Okay, so we're both recording. If you're ready, can you record at your end
No,
still?
no, I'm gonna go recording now then,
Okay,
because
you
what
try
I'm
to
gonna do, I'm gonna cut.
see
So
if we can both record at once. I think it's possible.
Yeah, it's recording now.
Beauty. Okay, so that's two recordings either end. Good. Alrighty. Okay, roll away.
Okay. Professor Steve Keen, welcome to this short interview.
Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So in Sweden, we have a finance minister that prouds herself about her sound finances and that running a government surplus is a good thing. So what do you have to say about that? Is that so? And how does it, what are the implications for society, for businesses, for the economy, and for households when the government runs a surplus?
Yeah, I mean, I understand people getting confused about this because everybody tends to think about what they're doing from their own perspective. So a government minister might think, well, the government should run a surplus. That's a good thing, you know, put money in the savings account, save for a rainy day. The sort of lines that you heard coming out of Cameron and Osborne in the UK when the UK was trying to run a surplus after the global financial crisis. But when you look at the financial system, you have to look at the integrated system of accounts, not just what happens to your account if you save money, what happens to other people as a result of you trying to save money. And the simplest illustration of that is just with individuals themselves. If you attempt to save money, you yourself can't create money. So what happens is you save money, which means increasing the amount of money in your bank account, by slowing down how fast you spend on other people. Now that has two impacts. One is that the demand falls, aggregate demand falls because you're spending less. And the second is your bank account rises, but everybody else's bank account falls by precisely as much as yours rises if we don't actually have any money creation going on. So that's the simplest illustration. And that's one reason Keynes talked about the paradox of thrift, that if you have people who think, oh, you know, it's good for society to save money, and then individuals try to save money, and what they do is they slow down how fast money circulates. And the impact is that there's no change in the amount of money, but GDP falls. And so income falls because of the attempt to save money. So that's the general perspective. Now, when you take a look at it at the integrated level, looking at government, non-government, banks, non-banks, and so on, it ends up being obvious that if some entity in that system collectively runs a surplus, then the remaining entities have an identical deficit. Simply mathematically logical, and I can show that on my Minsky software if you want to do that in a moment. So if the government's running a surplus, the rest of the economy is being pushed into a deficit. Now, you can balance that if the country's running a trade surplus. So it's quite possible for a country running a large trade surplus to have a government running a surplus as well, and the private sector can also run a surplus because all the negatives are being put on the external economy. But at the general level of the global economy, if the government runs a surplus, then the private sector runs a deficit. And therefore, rather than government saying, it's a great thing we're running a surplus, we'll say, well, are you saying it's a great thing the private sector runs a deficit? And that's when we start getting interesting questions rather than, you know, sound bites about saving for a rainy day and so on.
Okay, so this actually means that you're starving the economy?
Yeah, in a fundamental way you are, because that comes into the role of the government as one of the two institutions in a society which can actually create money. And I think it might be useful for me to start using my Minsky software at some point to illustrate this. But if the government decides that it should run a surplus, it's not just causing the rest of the system to run a deficit, which would be the case of, you know, the private sector. As part of the private sector tries to run a surplus, then the remainder of the economy runs a deficit from the point of view of that particular entity. But that's not changing the amount of money in existence. Now, if the government runs a surplus, it's actually reducing the money supply, and that ends up starving the economy. And this is one reason why countries that attempt to run a surplus, when they're not running a trade surplus at the same time, end up continuing to do it because they keep on trying to reach the targets and keep failing. And because the target is not the level of debt, it's the level of debt divided by GDP. Now, if what you're doing causes GDP to fall faster than your debt falls, your attempt to save money, reduce the debt ratio, can actually increase it. And that's what has happened in numerous countries who've tried this in the past.
Okay, so it's actually also get tighter conditions for businesses. And with tighter conditions, you're going to have less investments.
Yeah, it cascades through the economy. So if you're taking money out of circulation, then what happens is there's less money around. So you start getting two things coming out of it. One, there will be potentially less investment, so the rate of growth slows down for that reason. You can even have people spending money more slowly in general, so it slows down again. And also what you can encourage is speculative behavior. And this is quite a fascinating thing. When you look at the last time any country ran a sustained government surplus for a substantial period of time, it was the United States in the 1920s. That we have Calvin Coolidge. And like the 1920s was a period of immense prosperity for America. And he was convinced the surplus was because the prosperity was because he was running a surplus. And his surplus is almost precise, varied a bit, but pretty much 1% of GDP every year. And over the period of the 1920s, his presidency, government debt fell from 30% of GDP to about 15%. And he really said, this is the basis of prosperity. It must be continued. Well, not long after he lost office, the Great Depression hit. And then when you take a look at the data and see what was going on, at the same time as the government was running a deficit, a surplus of 1% of GDP, therefore taking the equivalent amount of money out of circulation, the private sector was borrowing from the banks, indirectly because they were mainly speculating on the stock market, 5% of GDP. That's what gave you the boom. Enormous bubble in private credit in America in the 1920s. And the most telling part of that is when I renormalize the numbers so that the data after 46 is consistent with that beforehand, because since the Federal Reserve has been doing this, we have a better record keeping of private debt levels. But what it shows is the level of margin debt, and that's money you borrow from a stockbroker to gamble on rising stock prices. That rose from 1% of GDP in 1920 to 13% of GDP in 1929. It then crashed to virtually zero with a stock market crash. And the simple reason is shares were falling, margin calls were brought in. Anybody didn't have enough money to meet the margin call by selling their Rolls Royce or whatever else, and there are plenty of examples of that, went bankrupt, lost all their assets, and eventually you drop down to zero. So you had this huge speculative bubble and then a collapse. And you can actually argue that, first of all, definitely the prosperity of the 1920s was not caused by the surplus. It was caused by the deficit the private sector was running to make up for the money being taken out of the economy by the government. And secondly, this encouraged in many ways, because the money supply is falling, it encourages you to go to the banks. And that's what led to the huge level of private debt, and why it was so drastic, because twofold. Margin debt has never been that high since. The highest is about 3.5% of GDP since then. 13%. And growing by 12% of GDP over a decade is just incredible when you see the data. And that's what caused the stock market bubble. And then the crash on the other side. And of course, that's why the Great Depression was so much worse than the 2007, 2008 global financial crisis. Because after that experience, margin debt was restricted to being, you could borrow 50%. So if you wanted to buy $1 million worth of shares, you had to deposit $500,000 in cash and borrow $500,000 from the broker. And so, $500,000 could buy you a $1 million portfolio. Back in the 1920s, you put down $100,000 and bought $1 million worth of shares. So the leverage was that much higher. Anyway, that's a long story, but the basic thing is, when people have looked at the past data and said, look, Calvin Coolidge ran a surplus, what a great period the 1920s were, and they try to treat the 1930s as a separate event. The 1920s caused the 1930s, and a major factor of that was the government running a sustained surplus.
So running a sustained government surplus and saying it's good for the finances of the state and financial stability is actually totally on the other way, because private debt is that which, as if I understand you right now, also is what causes all the crisis. And when you have a government surplus, you actually drive up private debt, which is also to increase the likelihood for financial crisis. So what is called sound finances is actually unsound finances, if you look at the total picture.
Yeah. I mean, and that's why you've got to look in an integrated way. And it's not possible for you to look at the financial system in an integrated way using conventional economics, because conventional economics mean neoclassical supply and demand analysis, which is the sort of stuff politicians get taught when they're at university, is actually based on a world where there's no money. It's a barter system. And they then try to give you guidance about what to do with money when they take a look at things like government debt and so on. So what they argue, and I can see this in terms of their supply and demand analysis, everything gets turned into supply and demand. So you have demand for money and a supply of money, an upward sloping supply curve, downward sloping demand curve. And the argument is that if government runs a deficit, it adds to demand, which pushes the interest rate up, causes less borrowing to happen, slows the economy down, and the government has to pay that back to the private sector. And that's the vision you get out of mainstream economics. Now, when you look at the accounting properly, and that's why I invented Minsky as a software package that lets you look at it, accounting in an integrated fashion, the actual result is, in effect, the government deficit adds to the supply of money. If anything, it'll drive the interest rate down, which is more likely to encourage more investment, not less. So the causal process is the complete opposite of what politicians get taught at universities. So I don't blame politicians so much. They're just spouting effectively what they were taught and they accepted in the textbooks. I blame the textbooks.
Yeah. So it's the economic teaching which is totally backwards.
Yeah, and it's because, I mean, there's a Paul Krugman, of course, would be an outstanding example of a mainstream economist. And Krugman is giving what's called a masterclass now for some company, letting people commercialize their skills. So he's selling this masterclass. I'm not going to pay up for it. I might for the fun of it at some point if I can afford to throw away some small amount of money. But as part of promoting it, the little video you'll find on YouTube, he talks about how economics lets you clear away all the dross and focus on the important detail. And having said this, he says it's about people. It's not about money. Now, I'm sorry. It is also about money. And the ignorance they've got then turns up in politicians who are ignorant but think they're well informed.
Wow, interesting. So if I just try to make a conclusion of all this, what you say is that when government runs a surplus, aggregate demand goes down, and that gives tighter conditions for businesses.
Yep.
And that would mean that's going to be less investments because they don't believe in the future that the investment's going to pay off, and that's going to mean that productivity slows down, and that's also going to mean that you get higher unemployment, and that wages share of total income in the nation is going to decrease.
Yep.
And then we're going to enhance financial instability because private debt is going to go up.
Fundamentally, that's it. I mean, I can actually give would it be useful to give an illustration using my Minsky software, doing it as simply as possible?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, let's give it a try. So I'll just share the whole screen. So this is Minsky, and what Minsky does is let you model the banking sector. So I'm just going to create a set of tables here. I'll call this is the banks, through which the government has to operate, of course. This will be the Treasury, which determines whether a deficit or a surplus is run. This is the central bank. And then finally, we have the public. That's our basic picture. And I'm just going to just make these a bit larger, bring up the editing window for each of these. And let's see if I've got them all there. So I want to illustrate what happens. I've got this is actually my model of Calvin Coolidge, but I'll put that out of the way. So I just want to show what happens when you look at the economy in an integrated fashion, not looking at it as separate bits, but looking in an integrated way. Well, for one thing we know, of course, banks are where we store our deposits. So the deposits of the public sector are a liability of the private banks. And one of the assets that the private banks have are bank reserves. And then if you come down to the public, well, I can now show the deposits are an asset of the public. And I'm just going to label each of the groups here as having an equity. So what I'm looking at is the assets, the liability, and the equity of each of these parts of society. And what I'm looking here is assets which are a claim on somebody else, liabilities which are a claim somebody else has on you. And when you look at it the aggregate fashion and just restrict it to those assets and liabilities which are claims on other people rather than stuff which is independent, the sum of all equity is zero. So I'm just going to put the equity levels in. Pardon me, what have I done wrong there? That's CB. That's just so Minsky to stop me making it. That's a central bank equity, and this is the just delete that one. This is Treasury. So I want to look just at the simple idea of a government running a surplus. Now, what happens if the government runs a surplus? So we'll start with the banks. And if the government runs a surplus, then how does it do that? Well, it runs a surplus by taxing the private sector more than it spends on the private sector. So a surplus will take money out of the deposit accounts of the private of you and me in the private banks. That's going to be minus a surplus there. Now that has to be, Minsky enforces what's called the fundamental law of accounting, that assets minus liability minus equity has to equal zero. So I've got to now balance this and say what happens to bank reserves. Well, if the deposits are falling, so are the reserves. So it's a minus surplus there. And now I've got reserves over here. Let's look at the public, pardon me, first of all. This is the public's account here. And what's happening? Well, if its deposits are falling, then what you're seeing is the money, the net worth of the public, you and me. It's we use the public for the private sector. It's one of those unfortunate things English people do. Used contradictory terms for the same thing, but the public is the private sector. Then we come across to see what's happening at the central bank. Well, the reserves of the banking sector, they're an asset of the private banks, but they're fundamentally the bank account of the private banks at the central bank. So there's reserves. Okay. Now I've now got to balance this because, of course, it's not the central bank that suffers or gains from the surplus being run. It's actually the Treasury. So if I now type the Treasury as having an account at the central bank, the surplus is a transfer of money from the reserves to the Treasury. Now, if we come over here and look at assets of the Treasury, what we've got is the running the surplus causes the Treasury's equity to increase. So that's what's going on. So at a fundamental level, a government trying to run a surplus is causing an identical deficit for the private sector. Whereas their belief is they're unburdening the private sector by taking money by taking government debt load off their backs. It's actually the reverse. Now, if I'm just going to for the sake of it, I'll show what happens if the government runs a deficit. And this is a bit contradictory. I've got the two in the same table, but I want to just illustrate the sign of all this. So if you're on a deficit, then you're putting money into deposit accounts. And of course, that increases what's available in the reserves. That increases what the private sector has as net equity. And if we take a look at what's happening over here, the deficit means a fall in the Treasury's accounts. And then to balance that, bring it over here. So the deficit is putting the government into negative equity collectively, whereas the surplus puts into positive equity. So that's the difference between the two approaches. Now, what happens when you issue bonds? And this is what governments are talking about doing by retiring debt, is basically reducing the level of outstanding bonds. But if you look at what bonds are sold for, when the Treasury sells to the banks, selling for bonds, then what you have to say is, well, there's now a new asset, which are the bonds held by the banks. And so we're going to have bond sales to the banks by the Treasury. Now, how do the banks pay for that? Well, they actually pay for it using reserves. Pardon me, I've got to use a minus there. And how do how do the banks get that money in the first place? Well, if the government's running a deficit, the deficit creates reserves as well as creating deposits for the non-bank public, and it's that money created by the deficit itself which is covered by the bonds. But the banks therefore will buy the bonds. They're never going to turn down the offer, because what they're being offered is a deal to convert non-income earning and non-tradable reserves into income earning and tradable bonds. So there's never a possibility of a government that issues its own currency, and thank God Sweden does, okay, running out of buyers for its bonds, because the very act of running a deficit creates the reserves that are used to buy those bonds. And the whole idea of bond vigilantes refusing to pay debt or demanding a higher interest rate, they don't have any interest rate at all, because the offer they're being given is convert reserves which earn no interest into bonds that earn some interest. Something you can't trade to something you can trade, of course they're going to take the offer. If I feed this through, what do the bond sales actually do? What the bond sales do is they enable the Treasury to maintain a positive balance at its account in the central bank. And that's one thing most governments require. They don't let the Treasury operate a negative position there. But it's really not the bond sales that are financing the deficit. The deficit finances the bond purchases by the banks. So the obsession with getting bonds down is just it's a badly placed attitude to what actually is done by the banking sector. And that's, you know, it doesn't take long to lay that out. And it's simply accounting. It is not left or right. It's both sides of the book, left and right.
Wow, thanks, Steve. I mean, that's got quite clear. If you understand accounting, then you really understand what you did right now. And that also shows that bond sales are actually preceded by government spending.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, the timing is a different story. I mean, a lot of governments, and I've had some fights with people over this in monetary circles, because some of the, you know, one thing I do understand is dynamics. And a lot of people who would talk at this, whether they're in the government or in the opposition groups, don't. And they think, oh, the government's got to have the money in the account before it can do this. Well, yes, the laws can require that. What it then means is that you have to look at the history of what's happened in the past. And as it happens, interest payments on outstanding government bonds actually creates reserves for the private banks in the first place. So those residual past earnings are what partly create a positive balance of reserves, which then means when the government's done past bond sales as well, it means a positive balance in the Treasury's account at the central bank. And then what you've got is it's a very complicated legal procedure, and, you know, sales of bonds and all that sort of, you know, process that the Treasury officials and the central banks go through to maintain that above zero. But it's fundamentally, ultimately, the deficit is the source of the money that is used to buy the bonds.
Yeah, and the rest is just complications through different regulations and law, whatever they put on there. Okay. Steve, thank you very, very, very much for taking your time and explain this to us. And let's see what's going to happen with your political career in Australia. It would be really interesting to have someone who understands this thing in the political game in Australia, because that could actually open up the door for many other countries and for politicians to do the same thing, to stand up for what's factual correct.
Let's hope so.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. All right.
So I just stopped.